frischer Wind, der weht. Aber dafür ein sehr interessanter Vortrag heute, denke ich, glaube ich und weiß ich sicherlich schon. Lieber Freek Persyn, liebe Lehrende, liebe Studierende, liebe Gäste, für viele von außerhalb des freut uns immer besonders. Ich begrüße Sie zum heutigen Abend, einen weiteren Abend, an dem wir uns mit dem hochspannenden und aktuellen Thema der neuen Werkzeuge im Anthropozän widmen. Was die neuen Werkzeuge für Sie als angehende oder schon praktizierende Architektinnen, Architekten und Menschen, die in dem Metier arbeiten, bedeutet, versuchen wir ja in dieser Reihe zu beleuchten. Und dazu haben Adria Darawan und Frederik Schnee, die die Reihe hauptverantwortlich kuratiert haben, eine ganze Reihe von Menschen und Persönlichkeiten ausgewählt aus den Bereichen Architektur und Kunst, Design und Wissenschaft und schließlich zu uns an die Hochschule eingeladen. Und einer davon ist, da freuen wir uns besonders, Freek Persyn, der heute hier bei uns ist, der sich auch schon sehr lange mit diesem Thema beschäftigt. Wir hören gleich mehr von ihm, deshalb halte ich mich an der Stelle jetzt kurz, da nämlich Kim Nguyen, ich hoffe, ich habe es richtig ausgesprochen, den Nachnamen, den Freek vorstellen wird. Das machen wir jetzt seit dieser Reihe so, das ist immer Teil des sogenannten Kollektivs, das sind Studierende, die die Reihe mit vorbereiten und organisieren und in dem Fall jetzt auch die Sprecher dann vorstellen. Also Kim kommt gleich nach oben, danach hören wir den Vortrag und dann wie immer machen wir eine Frage- und Diskussionsrunde. Und wir bitten Sie und euch, sich daran zu beteiligen. Es ist immer sehr schön, wenn ein paar Fragen aus dem Publikum kommen. Sicherlich auch ganz spannend heute. Und ja, organisatorisch ansonsten, was kann ich noch sagen? Achso, die AKNW-Bescheinigungen sind doch ein paar da. Deswegen, sie sind endlich genehmigt. Das ist fast ein Applaus wert, nein, nicht. Aber es hat sehr, sehr lange gedauert. Sie sind genehmigt, sie sind auch vorne am Empfang, an der Bar nach dem Vortrag zu erhalten. Genau, ich bitte wieder alle, die den Raum verlassen während des Vortrags, die Tür leise zu schließen. Vielleicht können wir die heute sogar auflassen, damit ein bisschen Durchzug ist. Müssen wir gucken, wie draußen die Lautstärke ist. Okay, ich bedanke mich schon mal und bitte Kim auf die Bühne.
Guten Abend alle zusammen. Vielen Dank, dass Sie heute dabei sind und sich für den heutigen Vortrag Zeit genommen haben. Ich bin Studentin in der Mastervertiefung Corporate Architecture. Wie bereits erwähnt wurde, habe ich das große Vergnügen, Ihnen heute Abend den Redner Freek Persyn vorzustellen. Freek Persyn wurde in 1974 in Belgien geboren, lebt und arbeitet derzeit in Brüssel und Zürich. Im Jahr 1997 absolvierte er sein Architekturstudium an der Sinbrook School of Architecture in Brüssel. Kurz darauf war er Mitgründer des Büros 51&4A, das sich auf Raumgestaltung spezialisiert und den Schwerpunkt auf städtischen und sozialen Wandel legt. Das Büro arbeitet auf verschiedenen Ebenen, von Entwurf, Strategien bis hin zur Realisierung. Es ist bekannt für seine Umnutzungsprojekte in Europa sowie sein intensives Engagement in Albanien. Seit 2019 kombiniert Freek Persyn seine Tätigkeit bei 51&4E mit seiner Professur für Architektur und urbane Transformation an der ETH Zürich. Sowohl Persyn auch als 51&4E engagieren sich in Projekten, die bestehende städtische Strukturen revitalisieren und Räume schaffen, die kollektive menschliche Interaktion fördern. Ein Beispiel dafür ist die Transformation des Skanderbeg-Platzes in Tirana, Albanien, bei der die komplexe Geschichte der Städte berücksichtigt wird, um einen neuen urbanen Raum zu schaffen, der durch Veranstaltungen und menschliche Interaktion belebt wird. Das Buddha Art Center ist ein weiteres Projekt, bei der Leerflächen in Räume für Interaktionen umgewandelt wurden. Weitere Projekte von 51&4E umfassen das SIN-Projekt und das innovativen Funktion und das nachhaltige Design in das städtische Ökosystem integriert, sowie das C-Mine, Kulturzentrum in Genk, Belgien, das flexible und anpassbare Räume bietet. In seinem Vortrag How to Not Demolish a Building wird er das Projekt Sinn in Nord mit der Umnutzung der Gebäude des World Trade Centers in Brüssel behandeln und den komplexen Prozess dahinter erläutern. Wir heißen Herrn Professor Freek Persyn im Namen der Fakultät Architektur herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns, Sie nun auf der Bühne begrüßen zu können und einen großen Applaus für Professor Freek Persyn.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being with so many people, equally spread across the room. Looks very cozy in the background. Like the equivalent of a TV dinner, it seems. So you already had the introduction, which will save me a bit of time. Thank you for that. So the lecture I have taken to tonight is something that responds to the notion of Anthropozän, but just in a way like anything we do answers to the question of the Anthropozän, because the Anthropozän is in a way nothing but one of the expressions of ages or decades, centuries of industrialization, and also capitalism. So I think it's a situation we are all in, and we from 51 take it at heart of dealing with that question. So we are from 51 is from Brussels, the place that you see here. Stands for the coordinates of Brussels, 51 North, 4 East. And today I will talk about questions around how not to demolish a building. But first I'll introduce quickly what the situation is that we're working in, which is, I think, a situation very similar to the situation that you are working in. Because Brussels is here, right in the middle, part of what is called the Blue Banana. And I think this city is also part of the Blue Banana, the most productive and richest economic region of Europe, the center of Europe. And yeah, I think this is something we all do daily. We produce stuff, we create value. And this is in a kind of bizarre, according to me, contrast with the way how the environment that is produced in this area looks like. So this is a zoom on Flanders. Brussels is here. Here you are there on the left. And so I think this image shows very clearly how an area which is the result of a lot of focus on production, how it also is resulting in a lot of fragmentation. And this reminds me of image, an artwork of a friend of mine. This is called Landscape of My Personal Belongings. And this feels very much like the territory that we inhabit. And we take it as a kind of task on ourselves, as an ambition that we have as architects, to not focus mainly on these objects, but really to focus as much as possible as on the relationship between things, and to work on that. And in that sense, to maybe counter a certain fragmentation, and to, in an attempt to try and focus on relationships and trying to focus on environments, also making environments. Of course, this is not something that is an individual's task. This is an image of an event we had at the office, but I will tell about that later. But just to give you an idea of the scale, we are more or less 60, 70 people, and we collaborate a lot. So we're really almost like an ecosystem. We work on multiple topics, which have a lot to do with adaptive reuse. So working with the inherited environment and trying to deal with it and trying to adapt it. This is on multiple scales, on the scale, for instance, of infrastructure, which is a question ultimately which makes you realize very strongly that architecture and infrastructure in general is always about combining different perspectives, which is something that we try to open up, the amount of voices and perspectives included. We also try to use design to give people experiences. And this notion of adaptation for us really makes sense on all scales. For instance, here on the scale of the square that you just mentioned, the Skanderbeg Square, which is an adaptive reuse of an open air space, the main square of Tirana in Albania. It also makes a lot of sense in maybe the most classical Flemish Belgian example, the kind of refurbishment in the backyard of an inner city plot. And more also the adaptation of what you could call suburbia, or the kind of urbanized territory, which links very much to the map that I showed in the very beginning. And in Albania we have learned to deal with the context, which is very much at the beginning of a new wave of, let's say, development of a regime changing. In Brussels, the place that I will talk about today, is very much trying to deal with the context that has already been invested a lot in. And it's really about dealing with that heritage. In that case, for instance, a tower in the central Brussels built in the 60s that I will also talk about later. So you see it's quite a diverse range of things that we're busy with. And also for us to communicate it and to try and understand it for ourselves, we have focused recently on making that complexity tangible, manageable, also digestible maybe, by making books which are about looking at one aspect of what we do and trying to reveal, let's say, the depth of any kind of architectural project. So I don't think this is something special in relation to what we do, but maybe the way how it's talked about is very specific, in the sense that normally I have the feeling that people tend to go for the result, or for the thing that is most catching the eye. In these books, it's an explicit attempt to take a slice of the work and to go very deep in that slice. So for instance, here in the Skanderbeg Square, it's a book of maybe 100 pages only about that square. So it's a bit of an excessive amount of content, but somehow it starts to stand as an example for other projects and for a way of thinking. This way of thinking is summarized, somehow shared also, a book we made called Design and Dialogue with the University in Zurich, and which tries to, let's say, dive deeper into the notion of designing and dialogue, which is not about trying to sell your project, but more, as it is described here, to see design as a process of dynamic learning, focusing both on the output and on the ways of working together. So not to make a distinction between what is result and what is method, but trying to fuse these two, and in an attempt to exceed the expectations of everyone involved. I think this is a bit the slogan that introduces the third book, which is called How Not to Demolish a Building, which I also have here. You can look at it later if you want. And this book specifically talks about a building that is extremely emblematic in Brussels, and is also very emblematic for what the Anthropozän is, what industrialization is. So that's why this case study, for me, it's interesting to bring it here as a kind of starter to start thinking about how to deal with this kind of heritage. So How Not to Demolish a Building, a book on the World Trade Center and its refurbishment, which is a very drastic refurbishment. This is one of the biggest buildings in Brussels. It's 100,000 square meters. And the adaptive reuse of it is underway. So the building will be finished end of 2024. The book is already published now. And the reason to publish it now is because we felt that because of its scale and because of all of the dynamics around it, that it was so meaningful to share the lessons that this project contains and to start to talk about it and to somehow already put these lessons in the public debate, even if we will have to wait for the finished building a few more years from now. And this building for us is interesting because the whole process around it was so messy and so complex and so rich, and it produced so many relationships that we had the feeling it's in a way only if you really address this kind of complexity and if you're ready to engage with all of this mess that you can start to do something. The North District, you have to know, is an area which is notorious for standstill, for things, everyone thinks something should happen and nothing really happens. And with this building, suddenly everything changed around, and we believe it has to do with the fact that suddenly this whole complexity and this whole difficulty was really totally blooming and bursting, and it was like a messy vitality. In order to make it digestible for instance, you as an audience, we have, and also for ourselves, of course, we have made the book in 5 chapters, which are, according to us, 5 things that you could deal with in order to turn around the status quo and in order to start engaging with the situation that you have inherited. So these are, as you can read, deal with the trauma, confront and learn, start with the structure, commit to circularity, and finally care and curate. And these are also the 5 parts in the book. This is the North District, 19th century Brussels being demolished. So what you see popping out, this kind of built mass, I think it's around 1.52 million square meters. And this kind of development started around the end of the Second World War, but with the highlight being in the 60s, 70s, with those kind of plans projected on 19th century city fabric, with the classics, the kind of high-rise towers, the separation of car and public domain, and the idea of international, flexible, neutral, available buildings. So really the prime real estate value for value creation. Being part of a global endeavor to produce those types of spaces. And of course in Brussels of different scale, but still very, let's say, straightforward. The idea was to demolish that kind of working class neighborhood, a very popular neighborhood, and to produce 67 or 76, I don't remember, towers. And in a way you can easily compare this to the motherboard of a computer, old computers, where you have a kind of infrastructure and you plug in systems. Of course, it also came with a whole demolition. In the case of the North District, it came with an eviction of 11,000 people. And so what you see here on the top, this is the North District. What you see here is the center. So it's an area very close to the center. But I think it's a dynamic that is not unfamiliar to the type of cities that you have here. But yeah, here you can clearly see in the time span of a few years, you have the promise of this, but the reality of that. And also the crisis, like any decade there's a crisis, for instance the oil crisis, where development halts, and that kind of situation becomes again what is kind of permanence. That this development of the North District gave rise to the organization of civil society in Brussels. So you could say, thanks to this project, civil society in Brussels really got organized, really also scaled up, and has become a force until now, with multiple generations of activists handing over, building up a real culture of saying no, a real culture of opposing, also opposing with projects. Projects, for instance, like this, with the biggest mural in Europe at the time, they said. But also projects like what is known in Brussels as the contre-projet, the counter projects, where citizens were drawing up together with architects alternatives for the city. And these alternatives actually gave rise to a kind of very strange hybrid between financial real estate and that kind of urban city fabric. What you see here in the beginning, like buildings which look like urban fabric but perform just like the World Trade Center performs. And so you have basically here at the end, you have the heart of the financial district, and in the front it scales down. You also see here, this is a picture from inside the World Trade Center. And here you also see how this kind of building was an archive of many types of information, pre-computer, of course, pre-digital. The situation we found ourselves in 2017 was that we saw in a real estate study this kind of graph of all of the leases of these buildings ending, and somehow these buildings being vacant. Leases of 30 years, 40 years, gradually the financial district became an administrative district. But here you see in this line how the vacancy of that area was imminent. We didn't know back then, but we know now that the developer and the investors, of course, also knew. And they made a competition to erase the towers, build twice as much, and to their credit, or maybe to the reality of the real estate market, they stopped this kind of renewal, also because they felt that it was clearly too much for that district in that place in Brussels. At the same time, this vacancy also means that in that area, a lot of other people come to use it. For instance, the Maximilian Park at a certain point there were a lot of migrants, also trans migrants, meeting there, sleeping there, staying over, and so you had this kind of that aspect of capitalism was also very present in the neighborhood, also because of that vacancy. And so in that situation in 2017, we started to engage with it, but more from the perspective of the school. And the way how we engaged became part of the second process, which I call Confront and Learn, which was a temporary use of the World Trade Center by a large group of people. That was kickstarted by this initiative, which is called Hybrid Business District, and it was a 2-week workshop on site, which was combining workshop with students, with public lectures, but also with a salon, where we discussed the outcome of the work we did with the students, with the investors of the tower and of the neighborhood, and where the idea grew that we could test something, and the test would be to look at the building fabric as it is, or kind of real estate portfolio, if you can call it like that. And to see how diversity could be tested. And so not diversity in the sense of having housing or having totally different program, but diversification in the sense of not just having big companies, but having a kind of model that allows for a wide range of what you could call office. For instance, a school, for instance, co-working space, for instance, spaces to learn, for instance, spaces to accumulate a lot of smaller organizations. And so we set up a project together with an investor for 1.5 years to, let's say, give out the space at cost, so heating, electricity, and in return, everyone that was part of this initiative would do something back for the neighborhood, so to do a project or to do an investment. And so a very clear time limit, a very clear experiment, 1.5 years, which was an open call for which we launched an open call with this idea, and in a very short amount of time, we had a lot of people reacting. And so in a very short amount of time, we could fill again half of such an empty World Trade Center tower, which is basically what you see here. So you should imagine 10 floors, 10,000 square meters maybe. That was filled with a wide diversity of people, which were uncoordinated, except for the deal with rent or with the costs, with the expenses, and the deal with giving something back. And for some reason, the area, the North District, very unpopular at the time, a place that no one would go to, suddenly became something which was very attractive to people, also because it is, of course, very central. It's catering for commuters, but in Brussels itself, not many people go there. And I think the strength of this initiative is that suddenly that was kind of, for this year and a half, the World Trade Center became a hotspot of sorts. The things that people gave back were very diverse in nature. So some people made a sandpit, what you see here, sandpit with a tower. Other people, for instance, the picture on the right is a picture of the activist group called Pool is Cool, which turned the roundabout in the district into a pool for 2 days. So they did all the checks and they did all the traffic diversion. So you saw very different ambitions, some very cute and clumsy, others very professional and very convincing. One initiative which grew a bit out of hand and which suddenly became a kind of neighborhood destination was the urban garden on the previous public domain. So this is on the 3rd floor of this plinth, which somehow brought together in a very beautiful way a lot of people that didn't know each other. And the kind of, let's say, highlight of the whole operation was an exhibition, collaboration between the Architecture Biennale of Rotterdam and an architecture workroom from Brussels to talk about the sustainable development goals in that building on the 23rd floor. So in that sense, the building became really the vehicle that conveyed. I hope this will not. Yeah. So the building as a test site, the building as a stage, and the building also as an exhibition. And here you see, for instance, the reception with the northern hemisphere as the kind of container for the World Trade Center. And so again there, the initiative was on the one hand very, let's say, very outspoken with the slogan, "The future is here," which was the slogan of the exhibition. Let's say almost overblowing its ambition. The other things which were also happening is here, for instance, on the right, Festival Illegal, which was a 3-day youth festival, which was taking place in the old shopping center, and which had a very rowdy and a very almost animalistic energy. So you have this kind of wide range of initiatives. It was truly fascinating. And so people really came to the building, came to see it, came to appreciate it. The World Trade Center was not a building that was actually very accessible. You could access the shopping center, but you could not really access the towers. And so suddenly this was a public venue where you were overlooking Brussels. And like they say, it's difficult to be down when you're up. I think this is really something that I've lived in the flesh. And also, what was very interesting, there was, for instance, an architecture school there for a year and a half, and they were offering a lot of, or producing a lot of critique. So they were really a critical voice, and so they were really also, in that sense, getting a stage in that tower. And so what for us happened in that year and a half was that something that was a very traumatic development, which was leading to a dead end, that we could pick up a few threads and start to weave something different. Very fragile, very maybe, I mean, you could say it's irrelevant to a certain extent, but nevertheless it's the beginning of something else. And this beginning was extremely, let's say, charming for sure, and also inspiring and gave a lot of enthusiasm. It was also interwoven with the investors doing a second attempt at rethinking their real estate. So on the left you see the kind of points that were listed in the exhibition. On the right you see the project atelier for the refurbishment of the towers on site. And this was something that happened, let's say, after 6 months that we moved in with our office. In that building, there was a competition announced to demolish the building and to replace it with something which would be a mixed-use, let's say, project of a similar scale. Again, 100,000 square meters, and they were looking for an architect to complement the contract of a big real estate architect in Brussels. And so it was a kind of 20% contract to somehow produce new ideas, to let's say, to spice it up, you could say. And we were really in doubt whether we would join that competition. Also because we had taken that role as this kind of activist of sorts, or this kind of people who were organizing that temporary use. And we were really not at all sure if we would be able to manage such a double position vis-à-vis this investor. So on the one hand, trying to negotiate for things to rent it out at no cost almost, and on the other hand, to suddenly become part of an initiative that would rethink the whole tower. And we also back then in 2017, we were a kind of young, promising office in Brussels, but for sure not an office that was known for that scale of project. We had the experience of the tower in Albania, that was our biggest project so far, and Albania is not really a reference for Belgian real estate. And so we started to talk to them because we had a good relationship with them in these 6 months' time, and we started to talk with them about entering the competition on the condition of being allowed to do a proposal which was about reuse, which they accepted. We were part of a large group of people. At the end, 3 were chosen to develop a short proposal, and we were part of it. And this led to, actually, to our surprise, having the position of being that kind of 20% architect. It came with the possibility of organizing the project in the tower. So this is, our offices were already there. At the time, I think we were 45 people. So we convinced them that it would be really interesting to do it on site, which also happened. And we were actually asked to prepare a proposal to look at the building in order that they could do preparatory work to actually do a second competition that they would do for a large kind of lease that they had heard that would come up, which is a lease for the Flemish government. So that was looking for an office location close to the North Station. And so this kind of first phase was really interesting because we were sparring with them quite one-to-one. And in our proposal, we had come up with a very simple idea, which was to take the towers and to connect them in a way not on every floor. So to remodel the building completely, to take parts of the floors off, and to connect the 2 towers with new floors, so that you could suddenly have a much more horizontal building, because that's what they were looking for. They already had a hunch that the tender that would come, that they would not want to be in towers. So basically the key question was how to turn towers into a horizontal building. And here you see a sketch of the engineer looking at different ways how the building could be reconfigured. This eventually led to a proposal where the two towers were indeed connected with a slab in between, a slab which is a building of 100 meters long and 25 meters wide, which is having double height floors. And so here you see the layout of the building, you see the existing cores, you see the existing pattern of the foundation, and you see in the middle this kind of large plateau connecting everything. This large plateau suddenly produces office floors which are 4,000 square meters, which is normally the type of size that you only find close to the airport or in those types of developments, and which is now under construction, and it's really like a factory in the air. Like it's, and interestingly, it's also reducing the amount of floors in the building. So rather than having a building of 28 floors, you suddenly have a building of 14 floors. So you have basically a building of 14 office floors stacked on top of each other, which allow a huge flexibility of infill, but also which allow in the towers to have the mezzanine floors used for something else. So you have these pink floors, which are 4,000 square meters, but you also have in the remainders of the towers two smaller floors, which is here on the top became eventually housing, at the bottom it became hotel. So you have this kind of very strange, unexpected combination of program in the building, which is clearly coming from starting with the structure and not from starting with the program. It's kind of, it's almost the logic of the building that gives that kind of program distribution. Also, for instance, the fact that the office floor has only 14 elevator stops makes that the programming of the elevator completely changes. And suddenly, without changing the course, you can enhance its performance a lot. And so, suddenly housing in what is an office typology, and so suddenly the two, let's say, qualities start to learn from each other. So here, for instance, you have a large balcony that we added to the housing, which suddenly also becomes a balcony that the offices will have. And so basically, that's what you see here at the edge. You see that everything is slightly remodeled, and at the edge on the west side, there's suddenly a row of balconies added. And so the whole idea became an idea of making the building, not only adapting the building, but also making it adaptable, so that we started to think of everything as something that could change. And also this program, whether it's housing or offices, that what you see in the blue here, that there's a kind of layer on top of a basic structure, on top of a capable structure that you think as changeable. And for the North District itself, we feel that it will give a very interesting ambiguity, where suddenly a building that looks like an office building will also be a housing building, where, as I said before, the offices have terraces just like the housing have terraces. And then a last thing, which I think, in terms of structural aspects, one thing we added to the program, to the structure of the building, was on top a very large roof terrace. So we promoted the idea of a public roof terrace that would be available for everyone. And what you see is actually the services being lifted, and in the space between the services and the last floor, suddenly this huge open air balcony really on top of every building in the North District. And so it's kind of this scale, so this kind of experience that people had, being able to go up on the building, look onto the building in the exhibition. This started to also convince the investor that that kind of idea would become very attractive. And so the scale of it is rather impressive. And so it's somehow the scale of it is just coming from what the building offers, and you somehow find gifts like this, which are rather unique. When we came with this proposal and we developed it together with the investor, a fourth thing happened, because when the Flemish government launched their tender, suddenly the ambitions on circularity were extremely, extremely high. So they really wanted to have this kind of flagship project to show themselves as a government being on the forefront of sustainable development. And this was, in the beginning, creating a kind of panic, because there was very little time. But very quickly, the investor really somehow switched their mind and really went for it, assembled a huge team around this question, and the building became really, I think, one of the biggest pilot projects on circular building in Brussels. So this is the buildings as they are, as they were, and here you see like one of the tests that we were doing. And so in this idea of circularity, we started not just by thinking the project on paper, but also trying out things here and there in the building. And this is one example. This is an example of trying to make openable windows, so to see how we could adapt the existing chassis and change the window. Also, for instance, how we could deal with the structure and how to fireproof it. And so suddenly the building became this kind of huge testing site to see how far should you demolish and how far can you not demolish, which is in a way something no one knows, and you only can find it out by testing. The kind of balance that we found in this kind of gradient of how much to demolish, how much not to demolish, was informed by the forces of the building, the future adaptability, etc. And so in the end, what we kept is the course, is the underground parking, and in volume it's around 60% of the building. But this was not it. Also for all of the other materials, this idea of circularity was really scrutinized, and a lot of new initiatives were tested out. One of these initiatives was to repurpose the concrete that was taken from the building. And so what you see is here the building being dismantled, being crushed, being somehow sorted out. And so there's concrete made of concrete, which, I mean, it's an interesting experiment. It's obviously much better just to leave the concrete in place. But for the things that were not fit to purpose anymore, that kind of test was made, and it was actually very interesting and very successful, because quite a lot of concrete has been is today recycled concrete. It's only the kind of main structure which is new concrete, but all the rest is recycled. And so we did this for a lot of things, and this is somehow the total graph of the metabolism of the building, where you see that this kind of 54 and 18% goes back into the building, and only 5.6% is waste. And of course, newer buildings are built in a much more sturdy way than buildings in the 60s. So you have this kind of whole idea of reuse on site, reuse elsewhere, of recycling, and of adding new materials which are in themselves traceable. And so suddenly the whole building became this kind of scrapyard, with things being reused, being somehow transported to be reused on site, some other things transported to other locations. For instance, there was a program of local schools that was serviced by this building. And so suddenly we got a kind of full frontal contact with this whole idea of how the whole city becomes a material resource site. One example, for instance, is the tiles of the roof terrace of the public domain. which are being cleaned and which will be repurposed in the balconies that I was talking about. But yeah, you should imagine this kind of whole material flow, which complexifies the building process even more, because it's not just about materials coming in, but it's also all the logistic flow of materials going out. And the kind of space of storage, of treatment is substantial. And also the most mundane materials were being reused, like for instance the plasterboards. This gave us the building as this kind of huge spreadsheet where we got to know everything that was in it. So that's a kind of material passport of the building. And this gives, I think, rise to a whole new way of thinking about buildings, where they are constantly in flux. And yeah, it becomes somehow an architectural project to start to curate that flux. And this goes in multiple ways, and one of these kind of longer processes that we started to organize, I want to share with you, is the one that has to deal with deals with everything that is plants and vegetation in the building. So as I was saying before, the roof terrace, there was the greenhouse, and also on every single floor we were thinking about how this very rough and basic structure that you saw, how you could have plants as kind of enhancing the quality of the air and the environment. The quality of the air here could be better. I don't know if you're also sweating. Yeah. This idea came also from the temporary use, where we were renting, well, we were occupying this floor, which had a heating system, or a kind of air conditioning system, which was slightly dysfunctional. And then we started to respond to that by occupying the floor with different types of plants. This is, for instance, a greenhouse that we made on the west side, where it was quite humid. And so suddenly this idea of plants in an office floor was something that everyone got excited by. I hope it will turn out to good excitement, but it was really in this kind of drive of that moment of being in the World Trade Center that this enthusiasm for plants and buildings got really, really big. And so with these floors being 5.5 meters high, and the floor packages being 70 centimeters, suddenly there was the opportunity of really planting big trees inside that kind of factory floors. Which suddenly gives a whole new collective scale to the building. And so we were, in the meantime, we had moved to another building in the North Station where we did this mock-up of this kind of interior planting. And yeah, this new scale got everyone even more enthusiastic. It was for us very attractive because we knew that the building, we had blown up its scale quite a lot. And so it would be extremely rough, almost like being in a bridge, under a bridge, you could say. And to suddenly have that layer of sensitivity and of softness, we thought that contrast could be really, really striking. And so this is the kind of thing that we are aiming for, that suddenly this kind of bigger scale would be domesticated, made more attractive. And with this also came the idea of treating the building as a nursery, so that the building would start to produce plants for the neighborhood, which was tested for a long time. Eventually didn't come through because of the way the tender was described. This was not possible. But that kind of idea still sticks with us, and I think we will probably use it in another project eventually. So the idea that things start to inform each other. And this idea also that a building becomes a collective environment, a public environment, that somehow also can compensate for the digital, that becomes a reason why people go there, to have a kind of common experience, even if the common experience is just sweating in a room. But yeah, for the North District, that kind of rethinking of what an office district is really important. And for instance, adding this greenhouse to the building, which is an unheated space, and it's also a space in between the building and the public domain, we think it will have a lot of added value, because office buildings in the North District are very often, what you see is the reception, you see the guards, you see kind of machines to go through, which are now situated on the first floor of the building. So first you go up and there you have the proper lobby. But surrounding that lobby, we have invented spaces like this, which are kind of interfaces with the city. And somehow the imagination that Pool is Cool produced with their temporary fountain, if you combine it with the greenhouse that we have imagined with this project, and you would start to layer kind of interventions in the public domain like this, where you step by step rethink public domain not from a master plan, but almost from private initiatives. For us, that's a kind of future that is very appealing. A future that is very difficult to realize. The amount of effort that Pool is Cool has taken to produce that kind of intervention is enormous. And it's very hard to, let's say, shift around the way how the public administration is thinking about traffic, for instance, for sure in Brussels. And so this is a process that goes very slow and goes step by step. The way how we engage with it is also very much step by step. So this summer we are trying to organize the closing off of one part of the boulevard and to install a temporary park. And so gradually we use, for instance, park-free Sundays to do something. We use weekends to somehow activate the public domain. And yeah, I think this is also something that starts to gain a certain traction, where we are no longer the only ones who try to do such things. And it becomes almost a terrain for people that have started to see that that kind of action starts to make sense. Yeah, so it's a lot, and there's even more. And for us, it's interesting to share this because it shows how to tackle, like the drawing that I was showing in the beginning, where you have this kind of dead-end lines which you weave in with new lines and with new directions, is that type of weaving that we think is really, really interesting. And that type of weaving is something that you have to organize for differently. And it's not about taking the question of is something demolished or not as a black and white question, or it's not a question of, I think questions are not black and white. For instance, if you look at this picture, which is the new floor of these towers, you can say, is this a repurposed building? Maybe the thing that is repurposed is more the fact that we have this kind of scale of 2 floors, which suddenly gives a scale which was unexpected, which you wouldn't be able to imagine in a new building. But a lot of things in this picture are obviously totally new, and it's even perverse to the point that technical engineers, for some reason, have managed that all those types of piping are not part of the calculations. So they are not counting for, this is simply not present in what is circular and what is not circular, at least in Belgium. I don't know how it's in Germany. So there's a lot of loopholes, a lot of kind of situations that make it very difficult to even impossible to have clarity on what we have to do. So how do you deal with the question of how to not demolish a building? And so I just want to give here a few clues on how we organize ourselves as tools for the Anthropocän, which might be tools that might be slightly unexpected. And so I'm very curious to hear what you think about it. One obvious tool is life cycle analysis. So here is for another project, you have life cycle analysis of 4 different approaches: light renovation, thorough renovation, low carbon new, and business as usual. it's obvious that in this life cycle analysis that business as usual is let's say, to avoid. The thorough renovation in this analysis looks the most interesting. It's an interesting case for architects. But actually, if you start to look at it differently and you start to look at the 60 years, and this is, for instance, the total global warming impact of a building, in the idea also that every 20 years you do a certain adaptation, you rethink, you somehow adapt the building a bit. That's the life cycle of the building. If you start to compare that to the light renovation, where you start with almost nothing, this is actually a very interesting proposition today. To, maybe sadly for architects who like to build, but in a way, if you look at the actual numbers, this kind of proposition where you don't produce carbon emissions very early on in the process, so the next 20 years, is a really interesting proposition when you think about climate change and how the tipping points will work. So that's really something to think about and to organize ourselves on. So pleading for light renovation really makes a lot of sense. And it comes with a big set of challenges. And I want to show this project that I showed before, which was the IBM Tower in Brussels, which was in the time span of the 2-3 years has been, we got to know these developers through the World Trade Center. And last month, this building opened, and there's now a hotel inside, there's offices inside, it has a rooftop. And so all of it is based on the idea of a light renovation. And so it activates building stock, but it requires, and this was a very difficult lesson for us to learn, it requires to listen to arguments which are not architectural arguments. For instance, the reason why this facade looks the same is because in Brussels there's a procedure that if you just renovate the building and don't change its facade, even if it's just about the looks, the building procedure is 1.5 years shorter. And so it's a kind of argument which, for an investor, is of course a killer argument, because to avoid that kind of delay, but you suddenly have to start compiling a project based on arguments coming from very, very different sources. And so you have to learn how to compose with different values and how to bring that information together. It puts you in a position of really trying to make knowledge together and to take everybody around the table seriously and to try and set up the conditions that all of this information comes in and is evaluated. Of course, we know this idea of the architect as the one that integrates, which I think is a very valuable aspect of the discipline. But the situation is probably a bit different in the sense that when you have that information coming from very different sides, and there's no one dominant person in the room, but this kind of balance of different insights, different perspectives, it's a whole different situation to manage. And of course, it only works if also the other people around the table do the same thing. But this is, for us, a real tool for the Anthropocän to somehow start to work with different perspectives at once and learn how to deal with that. It requires, in our understanding, to organize for self-steering. So for decisions being less top-down and for people being able to, when you sit at the table, to have the tools and the kind of information that you can really decide as much as possible on the spot, which is, of course, not all. I'm making an exaggeration here, but somehow the long processes of decisions being made without information at the top, and then somehow discussions at the table which are just about defending those positions, the people there and the people there. For us, that really doesn't work. And so we really want to organize ourselves for people being fully present and being as much as possible being able to take decisions and to take steps forward. This comes with being able to recognize how you think about something. And this is, for instance, a list of thought forms that we use to stimulate ourselves, to recognize how an engineer thinks, to recognize how an investor would think, and to somehow being able to read what happens around the table and being able to look for connections and for matches. It also comes with working with very different profiles, and that's what we try to do in the office in 51&4E. We are really a growing group of people with very different backgrounds, very different positions, and very different attitudes almost to projects. And so an attitude of an architect is often to get things done, and you plan for that thing being done. We have people in the office who are more busy with looking for alliances, looking for creating starting points. We have in the office landscape designers. We have people who are sociologists, not too many, but still. We try to somehow, based on what the question needs at a certain moment in time, to shift who has something important to say. And we see really 51&4E as much as possible as that kind of platform for collaboration. Another shift that we try to make is to let go a bit of the focus on objects or projects and to see something from end to end and to look more at programs which are a bit bigger in scale and which somehow use a project as a contribution to a larger question, where we somehow force ourselves to not put all of the ambition or all of the attention on one single thing, but more try to understand, if you're trying to think of a question of circularity, for instance, to think what could this project at this given moment in time contribute to that larger question. And so this idea of programs is really about trying to create longer-term value and to see projects as contributing to that value. And also, that's how we start to use these programs, is that questions are often containing lots of potential. And so if you start to think about investment, if you challenge yourself together with the client or with the people that you work with, the investment that we do now, what kind of return on investment or what kind of value do you create? And it changes the discussion if you start to do that. And we think it's a really promising way of looking at architecture as having a focus on value. That kind of idea of value creation also comes with setting up an organization that captures those values. 51&4E now has different initiatives inside. Some, for instance, ACT, CAST, Roots are more the classic expertise-based studios. But others, for instance, Lab North, is the vehicle with which we do all of the initiative in the North District, where there's an investment from the investors and there's an investment from us, and it's a totally different kind of conversation. What one I would like to show is Maison Nord, which is the former train museum, which is a space that we're currently renovating, which will host our offices, but will also host public spaces that are open for public to use or to rent or to, depending on the time of the day. And that's the kind of space where we feel it could be very interesting to start to make those alliances, these relationships, these interactions between people. That space is actually situated here. So this is the railway station, and we occupy the former train museum, which is a space of 1,800 square meters, really in the middle of things, and a space that is big enough to host those kinds of events. And yeah, maybe the strongest tool for the Anthropocän that we can imagine is to put yourself as part of this group of people that can start to move, that can start to react, that can start to be responsive to what is happening, because the only thing that we are sure of is that we don't know and that things will change. So that's what I have to offer to you tonight. Thanks. Yeah.
Also der Vortrag war noch nicht zu Ende.
So for the ones who are able to stay a bit longer and sweat with us, we would like to open the discussion with a few questions from our side and from the public. But starting by saying thank you for the very rich talk and also for reflecting on our invitation and reflecting on the possibility of thinking about tools. As we started the lecture series, we had Marc Angelique as our first guest, and one of his first remarks was how to think about the tools for the Anthropozän, and he told us maybe it's a solution to think about tools to work against the Anthropozän or towards the Anthropozän. So we are still thinking about which tools are we actually trying to develop together. But I would try to connect to one of the last issues you pointed upon, that of being part of the group and trying to respond to what you call the process more than a project. I was thinking about Hermann Čech, who started working in with the built environment quite a while ago, and one of his first thoughts on that was that working in an already built environment is so far different than planning in a new, because you deal with a lot of decisions that have already been taken. And insofar you have to work as a detective of the one way, also a historian. Best case, move inside the building and try to rediscover these decisions and reconstruct them in order to just continue working on them. And seeing the project that you offered, Zin, I was asking myself how many decisions were already taken in terms of demolishing and not demolishing. You were showing us these images about your tests, trying to see if the windows can open in a different way, how to work with already existing beams. But at the end, you had to take apart a lot of the built structure still. And what I'm curious about is at which point in the process you realize that, and how would you suggest to deal with that kind of situation? So reacting immediately and maybe reconsidering the project, because I was reading also your text and reading about the kind of disappointment that you already had during the process of design, because of realizing that you still have to dismantle a larger quantity of square meters than started with.
To start with, I think the example that you gave of Hermann Čech is exactly the same. difference is that the building is so big and the time is so intense that you cannot do that as a single person. So the whole idea, I think, the sensitivities and the kind of approach are totally what he describes. I think the big difference is that you cannot integrate it all into one person, and that's the challenge to organize it. So to keep that sensitivity and to keep that proximity and that combination of intelligence and intuition and analysis, for them to find ways to share it and to do it together. And it's difficult, I would say, and it confronts you with a lot of failure and a lot of things that are different than you would expect. But it brings you, on the other hand, also a lot of enthusiasm, and you also learn a lot. So it's you win some and you lose some. What you win is for sure, what you lose is for sure this idea of controlling everything. And I think this connects to your second question about the shift to make is to somehow constantly reassess. So, and to constantly adapt to changing circumstances. For example, if I look at this building, let's say in the office there was a kind of general consensus that ideally you would just renovate 2 towers, you would just change the plinth a bit, and that would be enough. This would not have answered the question of this kind of more horizontal spaces. For us, being there, we didn't feel that was so important. There are other ways to connect. And so you constantly, so if you're stubborn and you have made up your mind once, and you stick to what you thought 5 years ago, and this is the only thing that should happen, then of course this is not fun. That is very frustrating. So the fun is more in somehow adapting yourself to the fact that you can only do so much and you can only do the best possible at a certain moment in time. And there's no ideal situation. It's only what's ideal. And I think this answers a lot to the question of the Anthropozän. Yeah, the opposite, that we should not go for ideal things. So it might be better, like I'm already wearing sandals, it helps in a room when you step. So for instance, bankers, if they wear sandals, they wouldn't need to have those buildings.
They have a kind of authority.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the picture. You mentioned how to deal with vacancy in office spaces. So my question is, how can cities prevent long-term vacancy in the field of housing, especially in Brussels, or good your experiences of dealing with vacancy in office space? Also, how cities can implement this experience of value in cities. I mean, your example is vacancy in the office space, how can it in the field of housing?
I have to admit that I do not understand the question.
There's lots of vacancy in the housing.
Where?
In all major cities, say Paris and Stockholm, there's. But you showcase as an example how to deal with the office space. Could you think this could be also done in the realm of housing? I mean, you are converting it to a house already, and you know, but I'm thinking about since there's so much vacancy for long term in the major cities, how can cities or developers contribute to avoid this kind of issues?
Yes, I think the direction I'm thinking when I hear you speak is that cities can use their power to bring certain policies which allow to deal with that question. things I've shown, on first sight, don't look like they are informed about by policies. But for instance, the fourth one, committed circularity, was really a situation where the government set an ambition and was saying that's something that's really important, and the government has that power to set and change standards. So I'm not familiar with the vacancies that you talk about, but if I, for instance, think about Paris, where there's a lot of vacancy and a lot of homes being bought by people who just want to invest their money and not necessarily want to live there. It's obvious that there are policies that prevent that from happening. For instance, in Swiss villages, there's a certain ratio of houses that can be second homes, and if you are above that ratio, as a private owner, you don't have any say anymore.
So that's like public regulation and public administration.
Yeah, I think there's a big role for the government to play, to take over some decisions and to really say there is a common good, there is a kind of decisions to be made for common interest. And I think.
And how does it work as an architect? You work with public administration and the big developers. And such a big scale process, which is sort of a capitalist city, I would say. How can you integrate your social, cultural aspects more into those projects?
Yeah, it's a force field, I think. The dramatic thing about this area, but also the interesting thing is that there's no plan for it. So when we started doing that workshop in 2017, we talked with the city architect back then, talking about this idea that it would be interesting to rethink and invest in that heritage of 17th real estate. And back then, the answer of the public administration was that investors have reaped profit from that area for so long, now that it's going bad, it shouldn't come to the public to come and solve it. I think thanks to the persistence of the investor, and also I think thanks to the kind of dynamic that we have then created around it, there's a real interest in the neighborhood again, in the district again. It doesn't change, and it's still very difficult. It's not guaranteed success, but still. The district sits in an area which is where three communes come together, where there's no plan, where there's, and still they manage for a new development that is coming to ask that another set of two towers, that the towers would not be demolished, that there would be 10% program which is benefiting the neighborhood. So suddenly they were able to set certain regulations. And for investor and developers, it's, these conditions are very important. They often want clarity rather than anything goes. I know I'm not entirely answering the question. But,
No. I'm just guessing it must be extremely complicated to deal with different authorities within a city process. Because it's complicated developers. It's different, it's quite a lot of politics, I would guess. I'm just wondering how this works for such an application office to deal with those different mechanisms. But you are already answered that.
But for sure it's not clear. It's really also, and I think we once had a group of people from Paris visiting the North District because they heard about it, and they were surprised by the lack of instruments that they found, and the lack of regulations, and the lack of. Also, they were saying if in Paris there would be such a situation, immediately the city would follow and would somehow jump on that train. A city like Brussels doesn't have the resources to do them. So it's very messy.
Part of your method was spotting the building up front, or being there at the school, with the school and with your office, and also with all these organizations. And I was wondering if you all answer to have my next question, if this kind of project could be brought to a method in order to then work on the different buildings being on the verge of being empty, also in the North District on the one hand, and a similar situation in other cities. I remember a small-scale project. It's like a comparison between David and Goliath, but you visited us in Aachen in this project, pop-up campus, where we also formed ourselves to a sport group called us Fakultät, and then tried to develop a method out of it. And one of the issues is the social organism, and the idea of going inside the building, reconstructing the decision to check what was talking about, and acting upon the built environment enough. Is it one initial sparkle of this, and then the hard work, reality check, where the investor would follow up? This is how I understand it, because of Frederick's question. And so, to make it shorter, if you would be asked next to deal with a similar size project, would the first step be to move inside and understand it? Or how do you start a project?
I wouldn't treat it as a recipe book or as a kind of template to follow. And there's many things to say about the temporary use. One thing is that it's for sure not the spot, because we just made an agreement with the owner. We didn't break any law, or we didn't. It's not that we took a decision against the decision of other people. And so there's two aspects, I think, of this temporary use. One is that to inhabit the building and to witness it from inside, I think the strategy for reuse is extremely interesting. And the fact that it came with a group of people inhabiting it made it alive. And thanks to the critical mass of those people, there was a tipping point reached. And then, when this was done, for instance, the developer moved their offices to a neighboring building, and they were also on site. But it was just them in their offices with this one coffee machine. And it was such a sad experience. And it was almost proving that this was a counterexample. And if you're not part of a community, then you don't have the power to reinvigorate such a building. And of course, with this comes the question, what is the role of this community? And I think there's many people who don't want to offer that as a kind of, I think the disadvantage of this experiment, like we were a bit surprised by the success of what we set up, and we didn't anticipate the fact that it comes with so many expectations, and also with a certain responsibility towards the people that come, because we could also say to a certain extent we were organizing their precarity as well, because we were ready to move. I think we have moved in the past 5-6 years 6 times, also because we were not prepared, and it's really painful. But for us it was interesting because we had some, we had a certain, we are a large group of people, we can organize ourselves well. We were slightly aware of the cost that it needs to give. We also we started to build a network of people, of investors that were helping us out. From other people that came, this was at all not the case, and they were somehow building up hope and being supported. And so in the Spring Museum, we organized for 12 years, also with the idea to give it another perspective. I mean, for Klima, for instance, we have a sewing atelier for refugees. I mean, she's not there to revive the building. She just wants to do her lessons. And that's, I think, the big difficulty, and the thing that we haven't figured out ourselves is that, of course, for an investor, it's best to have as little transactional cost as possible. And of course, such a group of people present is a huge transactional cost. So the fact that they evicted 11,000 people from the neighborhoods was doing that. They were just clearing, and suddenly it was this kind of level playing field where people could do whatever they want. That's the big contradiction in trying to make something alive and then still treating it as plenty and manipulate as well.
So not only the contradiction. I was wondering if some questions are already on the paper sheets or lists in the public, because it's so hard that we wouldn't like to prolong the discussion too much. But then, yes.
Hi. The process of keeping buildings and rethinking on these resource and circular questions is, as we saw, a big job, and a job of many people. And you have to involve a lot of experts really early on. You involved also the public, and we just talked about the people that you got into the building in order to keep alive, but they also kind of became experts of the building. So my question is kind of directed towards those kind of experts, how to get them into a project. I think you kind of talked about this already, and I don't know if that's really answerable, but also the experts like planners that are looking at the building that have to be deconstructed, the parts that have to be deconstructed before you have to work with a lot of experts in that. How early on could you involve them, and how was kind of the payment method? Could you tell the investors, okay, we have to spend a lot of money now to analyze all of this, all of these experts, and know how to do that?
For me, you're more asking the right questions that I'm also looking for answers for, rather than that I would have answers to them. Because at a certain point, we were doubting whether we would renovate this museum and make it so the idea is that it's like 30% our space, 30% shared space, and 30% public. Or should we invest indeed in a group of people that we take this 2 million square meters and we just move and we just fill vacant spaces and we organize that flexibility? That was kind of, in the beginning we were more aiming for the second, but we had the fact that we moved 5 times was also because we got confronted twice with a kind of decision at the very end of a long negotiation process where one person of an administration wouldn't agree with something. And so we felt that we were not able to manage that really. So to somehow manage those long processes is and to be informed at the right time. That's really difficult, and is the whole, let's say, crux of the question. Because if you talk about engineers, we are now doing a project where we make a recycling park, and we have made made the recycling park very small, as small as possible. And so then we made the public space, which will become a skate park. And then we had the proposal of reusing a manege, how do you call it? Manege, equestrian center, this big hall, to put it on both. And it was perfectly lighted. But then the whole question of who validates that this structure can be transported, can be reused, who takes the insurances. So all of these things have to be invented. And there's things to invent because the fact that normally an engineer knows because he says this is what you should have, so you make it like this, and suddenly it's the other way around because this thing exists, so do we know if it will be good enough? Yeah, this is changing everything. So there's insurances that deal with that kind of. So you also need creative lawyers. And in the North District, the fact that we work together with these 7 big companies, there's a bit of like we are now busy with 5 years with Lab North, and it's not always the same companies who are interested. And so there's a certain flexibility. Same, that's in a way also there. It becomes a group of people that can together bring a question forward without that there's always kind of full intensity. That's the type of thing I think should be managed.
Did you think about to build this new in-between building as a wooden structure instead of concrete structure? Because I think Mehr is possible up to 24 stories with wooden buildings, and would have been an interesting contrast to the existing structures, and it's, I think, even more sustainable than the concrete or the recycled concrete.
Yes, it's true. I don't think this was considered. No. It's a good idea. And I think it's the reason why it's not considered is that the contractor is around the people. So the project is with architects, investors, engineers, but also the contractor. And it was also for us, also as an architect, to push forward certain ideas and then you tender and then you find the contractors that want to do it. Here, the influence of the contractor was very big, and even big to a point that the investor took the initiative midway to change the contractor. So they spent a year trying to prepare for a contract breach because the power of the contractor was too big. And so, yeah, that's also.
So it's business as usual.
But there's a lot of business as usual, but also I think also for us, of course we have much less power than contracting. But I think for everyone it's always partly business as usual.
Part of a traumatic development story.
Yes.
That actually has to use concrete.
While the microphone is wandering to the back of the room, where there's another question, this question brings me to actually an observation that I realized only during your talk. Actually, the project took place, thinking that you started in 2017, and it will end next year, more or less at a turning point. Also, not only in building, but also in our consideration of the urgency reacting to what we call the Anthropocän. That's why I was thinking, not knowing actually the answer, but how long we are already able to build up to 22 stories in a wooden construction. And I speculate, without knowing it, that 2017 it wouldn't have been already possible. So I think this is why it's very good that you decided to publish now, because it is definitely a learning project, and it's reflecting exactly on this time and on this change, on the turn of tables between also our understanding of the métier of an architect, curating the enormous Excel sheet instead of only designing the project, but also dealing with all these technological changes, which also need a legal backup, which is all happening. So it's following up one step after the other. So yes, that was the view. The other question was already ready.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the adventure of this film that you took us with to Brussels. And you used the term of, towards the end of the lecture, several times the light renovation, the light renovation. Here, and this I find really interesting, especially when it's up to deal with these heritages of the 60s and the 70s, the angle of the so to say big slabs that's in the landscape. And so there's now, let's say, a degree of lightness in this renovations, maybe starting from just taking care of the surfaces and renewing structures. And as well, sometimes the inhabited structures are being renovated while they are being inhabited. Let's say overnight, like Anthropozän put some balconies in front of it, but here, as a test site, all these structures were empty, which was a super opportunity to test so many things out. But this term of the light renovation here is pretty interesting, since that it seems that a whole new building was set up in between, although you presented it was like equally to all the actions and the performances that were taking part. And I like the quality of this, it's a mega structure that was put in between. But here, it is a huge structure that was added with a lot of new concrete. And to me, this we could be leading this communication, this label, so to say, of the light innovation. Who are you talking to when you use this light innovation term? It's a concept of the future, and is this project reference that you would try to work out under this label?
Well, I understand your question. I think the project of ZIN, of the World Trade Center, is a total renovation. And that's what I tried to explain. What does it mean?
Should I try to go back? You just have to tell me when to stop.
Yeah, so if you look at it like this, the World Trade Center is this. So it looks, in a way, it's the variation of the low carbon newly built, that it says the performance is really high. And if you look at it as a result, it performs very well. But if you look at it over time, the light renovation is actually more interesting in the times that we are now. And this is made for another project. So it's not made for the World Trade Center. So this is part of a group of projects being in contact with. in Belgium, there's a lot of, there was a reorganization of the state, now 25, 30 years ago, and a lot of the Belgian real estate is actually or sold to the regions, or it's not somehow. So at the end of the lease of life, and these calculations are made for those types of buildings, because there was a developer that bought a portfolio of these different offices throughout Belgium, which are no longer needed. They're very nondescript buildings. And there, the life cycle analysis showed that it's actually interesting to renovate them as lightly as possible. And what it changes for your job as an architect is that it becomes the question to find what would fit that building in terms of use. So rather than that you think of what you would like to do and then adapt the building to it, you somehow take very seriously what the building can already do, and then you try to find something that you make a program to the building. That becomes a very important question.
I don't know how prepared you are for further questions, but I think we have taken out of your energy. Also put you a little bit on interrogatory, which shows that the topic is very controversial and trying to understand how to react to our own, to the consequences of our work and our being here is not something that we answer immediately, and it's also not very easy to set up a set of tools on that, but it's been great talking to you about your experience with this project, because as I was thinking before, I think it's for us the most valuable point out of it was seeing how you learned to deal with it during this period of time, and how you very openly show the steps that you have done and also the lessons that you have learned. And this seems to be something that we carry on through the lectures, actually from the beginning, reflecting upon our work, and the guests that we had here now do the same. Thank you again, and thank you very much also for being with us tonight. We are welcoming you to a cold drink in front in the foyer, and I hope to see you next week to speak to our last guest, Freek Persyn, on the notion of care in order to temporarily close our research on the tools to deal with the Anthropocän. Thank you very much.